So by way of introduction, I'm Michael Goldstein. I'm the founder of SwitchPitch, and this is super exciting to me to put this webinar together because oftentimes I think when scouting startups and forming partnerships, you see tools that do one piece of the puzzle, but there's a full spectrum of how the process works. And so rather than showcase just one tool, what we thought we would do is get the perspectives of a whole host of people that cover the spectrum of identifying startups through to successful outcomes so that you can hear different pieces. And to moderate this, there was no one better to do this than my friend Scott Kirshner, who runs Innovation Leader, or was a co-founder of Innovation Leader. And I have respected and admired Scott and Innovation Leader for some time now. And we've done one other webinar, and I'm excited to do this webinar with him as well. So the format will be, Scott will tee us off, explain a little bit about Innovation Leader. Then each of the three panelists will discuss their specialty, and I'll explain to you the framework of that. And then we'll leave a lot of time for both Scott's questions at the end and then participants' questions at the end. So with that, Scott, I turn it over to you.
All right, awesome. Thanks for kicking it off, Michael. I will try to be super brief because I know that you all probably have a lot of questions and a lot of things to contribute. We have each of us some stuff to share. I would love to hear questions or rebuttals or comments at any point during my little brief intro and scene setting here. So feel free to use the Zoom question interface if you want to do some of that. Just kind of quickly about Innovation Leader, we like to say that we've built the biggest network of people who work in innovation, strategy, R&D, emerging tech roles inside big companies. Largely it's in the United States, but increasingly in Europe and the rest of the world. We really view ourselves as kind of an unbiased resource, where our two activities really are collecting information and publishing research reports and publishing case studies on our website, and then also convening people in webcasts and in person to kind of discuss what's happening in the world of corporate innovation. So moving to the next slide here, we just did a research report that we published in April that focused kind of on what are some of the best practices in startup engagement. So we were specifically not trying to boil the ocean here and say how do companies identify and work with startups in a productive way, but more trying to focus on the engagement, working with, getting pilot tests going with this report. We did a survey that had 115 respondents, and we also did some qualitative interviews with MetLife, Anheuser-Busch, Shell, the U.S. Air Force, the Schubert Broadway Theater and Ticketing Organization, lots of companies that had experience running accelerators or doing projects with startup. Going to the next slide here that talks about what was the overall experience level today. Companies that responded to this survey, and as I mentioned, there are about 115. We asked them, how much experience have you had with startup engagement? And we included everything from scouting to partnerships to running POCs to participating in accelerator programs. And you can see it was a group that was a little bit to the right of the middle of that spectrum at 5.9 experience level. And then this was interesting, how seriously would you say your company takes the threat of disruption, whether it's new technologies or a unicorn startup or something that's changing in the marketplace or with your customer base. And despite all the conversation these days around disruption, we only got to a 6.3, which may be different by industry. You may have some highly regulated industries that feel that threat of disruption a little bit less than maybe the hospitality industry or the transportation industry, where you have companies like Airbnb coming in and really doing an end run around some of the established companies. A couple other data points from this report. we asked, how do you engage? And this isn't going to surprise you that the number one way that big companies engage with startups is by taking meetings. 85% said, the number one way that we engage is we'll take meetings with interesting startups. I think obviously that, can be frustrating for the startups when it's like meeting number 3 and there's no contract on the table, no revenue in sight. Michael, I think you'd agree that most startups, by meeting number 2, if they don't know how revenue is going to come out of this, they're probably smart to not take meeting number 4, 5, and 6 with a corporate. But you can see rounding out the top 5, these companies are doing some kind of mentorship or participation in accelerator programs or incubators, maybe in their headquarters geography or other geographies that matter to them. They're co-developing new products or services with startups. The 4th bar there is participating in university startup programs. And the 5th is doing corporate venture capital investing. So kind of surprisingly high number there, but we do find that some Fortune 500 companies, while they may not have something that's called Acme Ventures, and has employees dedicated to it, they will do kind of sporadic ad hoc venture investments. If they get introduced to a startup, they sometimes write a check without having a more formal venture capital program. Next chart is just about biggest challenges. And so let's talk about the top 3 really briefly. Number 1 was just finding the resources and time to spend on startup engagement. Number 2, and startups, and I think a lot of corporates will admit that there's often a lot of paperwork and extremely lengthy contracts, negotiations that happen when you want to run even a very small test in a limited way, maybe in one store or with one sandbox tech environment. You can get tangled up in bureaucracy. And the 3rd one, which I guess is tied with the 4th reason, 4th challenge, is finding high quality startups that are relevant to us and conflicts with existing internal processes or lack of the right internal processes to make these partnerships work well. Moving ahead one slide to goals. It's interesting, the top goal is we want to actually test stuff that might be of value to our company in the real world. And number 2 is kind of, a little bit of, how do we change the way that we work on a day-to-day basis by bringing in tools and technologies and methodologies from the startup world. Some of that can be real and some of it can be kind of a little bit of a wishful thinking of, by working with startups, by collaborating with them, somehow the startup mojo and culture will rub off on your big company. I would say that sometimes you get a little bit of value from that rubbing shoulders with startups. And sometimes it's about just seeing the pace at which they work and the tools that they work with. But I think sometimes there's just a big cultural divide between how startups behave and how big companies behave. And it can, it can sometimes breed animosity just as easily as it breeds, information transfer or behavior transfer. And the last thing I want to touch on just from this report that we put out, where, I think we'll talk more about a lot of these as we hear from Michael and Maria and Jim, is that, there are these 5 issues to address when you're trying to think through what does startup engagement mean for our company. Number 1 is what's the strategy? Number 2 is do we have people who are going to be responsible for this on a day-to-day basis? Are they going to be visible outside our company in the startup ecosystem? 3rd is what are the actual tactics? The 4th is creating interfaces for startups to work with different business units easily without getting frustrated by endless meeting syndrome. And the last one is having some kind of report card or yardstick where you can make the case that this is creating some value, our customers like it, or we're doing things that help our employees with these startup partnerships, or we've been investing and there are some good outcomes to those investments. And then using that data and those metrics to go back and kind of refine issues 1 through 4, refine your strategy, maybe add some people, bring in some new tactics, think through having more interfaces, to different business units or different parts of of the company. So that was kind of my brief introduction and a little bit of a sample of some of the data that we gathered earlier this year. I know, Michael, you're sharing the deck from this webcast with people that participate. But if folks want to get a copy of this report, the full report, they can email me, scott@innovationleader.com, and I'm happy to send that out. But with that, I want to turn things back over to Mike Goldstein, who I don't know if you did a lengthy intro of yourself, but he has been a serial entrepreneur. He has been a startup seed investor. He is the founder of SwitchPitch, which we view as kind of the pioneer in thinking about extensible ways to do startup engagement and startup relationship management that don't just depend on one person with a lot of connections at your company. And SwitchPitch is based in Washington, D.C., our nation's capital. So, Michael, I'll turn things over to you.
Thanks, Scott. Appreciate that intro. And I just want to frame out who we have as panelists, because I didn't do that to start this off. So, as Scott mentioned, I started SwitchPitch. It's been about 7 years, the first 3 as an event where we got big companies to pitch to startups in a sort of unique format. And that's why we switched to was pitching, and hence our name. And the last 4 years as a startup relationship management platform that helps innovation teams identify and manage startup relationships. So that's the beginning of the funnel. And then downstream from us, I had only heard of Early Metrics and Maria over the course of time, mainly from teams in Europe that used Early Metrics to do financial diligence on startups to really de-risk the partnership. And so I reached out, I actually scouted Early Metrics as a panelist, and Maria is launching the Early Metrics offering in the US timed around now. So the timing is perfect for them. And it's actually very beneficial to SwitchPitch as well. We don't do any kind of financial diligence. So having a partner that does that is super helpful. And Maria sits in Paris. And then finally, I would say that I'm a specialist in scouting startups. Maria is a specialist in the diligence and the de-risking. And then Jim, who I've known for years, is both a specialist and a generalist. He's seen a lot. He has a lot of perspective. He knows this full spectrum probably better than anybody. And he runs a company, he runs a platform called Glidr, which is really for product management. And I'll let him explain that piece as far as what he does. But this is the sequence we'll go. First, you identify startups, then you vet them, then you pilot with them, and that's the order we'll go. So to start off my piece, and Jim sits in San Francisco. So to start off my piece, this is kind of the framework that we'll use to talk about startup partnerships. And if you've worked with SwitchPitch before, you've probably seen this framework. And it starts with building out an ecosystem, and I'll go into detail of each of these. But really where we end is sort of the de-risking, and you can manage the pilot with Glidr and then figure out how the startup is going to integrate within your company. Jim pointed out in prep for this that you can have, this whole process is sort of finding a needle in a haystack to identify a startup. And I believe that SwitchPitch probably has the best haystack based on the amount of data we have about startups, but it comes down to defining what the needle is. And so before you can even start this whole process, you really need to know what it is you're looking for, and more importantly, why you're looking for it. And Jim will talk about that piece. What is the significance of why you're doing startup scouting? My piece starts with you knowing that piece, and so I'll start with the ecosystem and database. Jim, did I do that justice?
Perfect.
Okay, good. All right, so the first piece is identifying startups, and so it all starts with an ecosystem. We have a database of about 115,000 startups at SwitchPitch, but there are certainly other options and choices out there. And so the most, I believe, obvious choice to build out an ecosystem is our startup accelerators. We've compiled about 900 globally that we know of. We hear of new ones every day. And so that is a significant source of identifying early stage startups. Now, not everybody wants early stage startups, and there are going to be people on this call that are looking for later stage startups because they don't want early stage, but accelerators are great for finding early stage startups. My tip for accelerator partnerships is get accelerators to provide curation and diligence for you. You don't have unlimited resources internally, and there is most likely at most accelerators someone whose job title is community manager or corporate partnerships. That person, they should be working for you, doing the curation of their startups for your needs. They should understand your needs. They should be feeding sales decks, future developments, client lists, all of those things that maybe you're doing internally as innovation leaders. Accelerators will do that. Next up are universities, and they are a prime breeding ground for startups. The local universities here in Washington all have startup competitions. I know that most globally have startup competitions, and they can identify startups very early and are very willing also to provide a lot of diligence. There's usually someone whose job it is to manage startups within big universities. And so my tip for the university relationships is get involved, participate with pitch competitions. I've participated with pitch competitions locally here. I've invested in startups based on those competitions and become a mentor based on that. And so that's a great way to get involved. The next piece here is going to be other large companies. I think this is sometimes an overlooked bucket where collectively you can identify startups. And I'm seeing more of these, like fintech and telecom have band together to find startups. There are certain people that they run the innovation that started, or the accelerator that started within one company, but then broadened it to an industry. And they introduce startups to a group of big companies. And so that can be an effective way. A lot of times we hear the problem with that is that they're not sharing data regularly and developing a process. And so the efforts that go in collectively are not being reaped across the board because there's not enough process or structure to sharing the data. And I'm gonna move kind of quickly through this. Venture funds are the next one. This is a pretty obvious one. This is another thing that I don't think venture capitalists are doing enough work for corporates. And I think that they will do more if you ask. They'll share lists, they'll share portfolio, maybe they'll do a dog and pony show with their portfolio, but I don't know if they're always connecting the dots and really getting their hands dirty to do their job to connect big companies with startups. Sometimes they do. Some are better than others. Andreessen Horowitz has a whole team that's just devoted to that. So clearly there are others, or there are some that are doing it, but lots are not. Okay, so multiple data sources. This is kind of my takeaways. Process for ecosystem leads and many internal contributors. The next piece is engaging with startups. And so some companies that we see do challenges. We host challenges on our platform. Challenges is a good way to find startups that are not sort of raising their hand otherwise, but in a database, but are out there. And so we promote challenges through accelerators and other university partners so that we can find the startup that maybe doesn't want to be found just yet and get them to apply. And so they're usually work best, and this is sort of how we started by doing these challenges at live events, where there's a specific business tie-in, a process for reviewing startups and getting lots of stakeholders, especially business units early on. And so that's my tip, get business units input early in this process. Moving down, qualify. This is really where Maria will end up taking over, but I'm going to just show you kind of the process here. So this is where you do analysis and diligence on a startup. So again, getting business unit feedback early. We see a lot of companies that will query their business units when they have a long list and say, give feedback on these. How do you rank this on the scale of 1 to 10 based on these different metrics? before the real diligence starts. Maybe first pass diligence happens and they have a long list of 20 startups, maybe 10, and they run that by the different stakeholders internally and even weight those feedback differently based on the importance of that person's feedback. Maybe they have a more important role in the process. So we have the ability with our platform to query internally and actually weight whose opinion weighs more. Stage of business. This is actually something that I'm going to spend just a little bit of time on. We have our own scoring. I heard someone mention TRL score just on a call today. And TRL score is pretty widely known. Technology readiness level started out of NASA in the US and then ultimately became a Defense Department tool to evaluate levels of startups. It's a scale of 1 to 9. Most people on this call probably know it. It doesn't work totally for commercial use cases. It's weird. There's like 1 to 3, everybody knows, and then 3 to 6 means something, and then sort of past 6 means something else. But it's not telling you in commercial terms what the stages are. And so what ends up happening is you see a lot of companies that will use stage of funding as their stage of the business, seed or Series A. Well, that can mean anything. I mean, Series A rounds, Jim will tell you, are 10 million or, $15 million now. Doesn't tell you what stage the startup is at. So we've come up with our own scoring where there's idea first, and then there's MVP, and then there's first customer, and then product market fit. And beyond that is multiple customers, and beyond that is scaling. That's a scale that works for innovation teams to figure out where they are in identifying where the startup is in their process. So that's what we started doing. It's a self-reporting scoring system that startups can do, but we also do it for startups as well. So just what stage is the startup at, and what stage you want them to be at. Obviously, financial experience and financial diligence and the founder's experience. This is going to be covered more with Jim, so I'm not going to spend much time on it. And then finally, hand off to the business unit. Staying involved is actually my one takeaway for innovation teams. Ultimately, most innovation teams are reporting on outcomes. And so a lot of times it's a black box what ends up happening to the leads that they're providing to business units. And so staying involved in tracking that information from a reporting level is super important for most teams. And then company adoption, again, tracking. And then that is the end of my piece. So my key points are: get others to do work for you, accelerators, universities, venture funds, external partners that can contribute to your internal process. Centralize efforts. A lot of times there's a lot of moving parts, and this team or this business unit is working and doing one thing in a silo where the innovation team is working in a silo. Doesn't work for open innovation and innovation efforts. And then get business units buy-in early and often is what I have to say. So thanks for listening, and I'm going to turn it over to Maria, who will pick up on the diligence piece.
Thank you, Michael. So hello, everyone. So the idea here is to give you more insights on how to evaluate a startup company. So now that you probably use SwitchPitch or any other solution to find relevant startups, they can help you address, I would say here, the business challenges you have internally. Kind of came up with a short list of potential partners. So how can you move forward and do your own due diligence to kind of find the best partner to work with? And the first point I wanted to tell you about is doing due diligence on a startup company, is very different from, evaluating a traditional company, right? Some startups have sometimes zero revenues, as Michael was talking about early stage companies. They do have a very, limited track record. So looking at financials or looking at the balance sheet or the P&L doesn't really make sense. So how do you look at a startup company? So when you look at a startup company, what you're trying to understand is more of the growth potential of that startup company. So what's the probability that the company is going to be experiencing a high growth in the future, right? So it's a very kind of established way to look at a startup, and for person A, B, C, an innovation team in that industry or another, we get the same results. However, I would say here a very kind of promising startup is not necessarily a good partner for you based on your specific needs, because this is something that Scott talked about earlier on. There are challenges with the corporate groups, and each corporate is very different. The company's risk culture is also very different. The business challenges that you may get from the business units are very unique, also to the industry in which the company is operating. So knowing that in mind, knowing that internal processes are also not structured the same way, knowing that you may not have the same level of resources internally to support your startup work, you need to kind of make sure that the company that you're planning to partner with is not only reliable, but also a company that fits your internal needs and challenges. And I guess this is the idea of my speech today. I wanted to kind of share with you those two steps that are very key in that process, in that funnel. So first, how to make sure that the partner is actually a reliable partner. Just because doing business with a startup company takes, way more risk than, collaborating with a company of your size. And then how to make sure that this is the best partner for me, depending on my needs and my challenges. So moving to the next slide. There is a very well-established way in the market, in the industry, to kind of make sure that a company is going to be a startup company is going to be promising and successful. You always need to kind of look at three things. First, the team, and then the product, but not only the product, I will talk about that right after, and the market. So starting very quickly with the management team, what you're trying to assess when you evaluate a startup company is the quality of the management team. So how you do that, right? First, you want to make sure that the founding team that you're planning to potentially collaborate with is very strong in terms of hard skills, but also soft skills, because we see that companies that do also succeed are not the ones that do have the market expertise and the technical skills, or the very general skills that are necessary to run a business, but also the ones that do have soft skills to kind of convince investors to invest money in the company, to kind of convince the first customers and things like that. You also want to make sure that the team is fully committed. It's not an issue when you're talking to a late stage company, but it can be an issue when you're dealing with that early stage company where the founders are not always 100% committed in the project. So I think it's something that you really want to be careful about, as it obviously impacts the execution capacity of that company within the upcoming POC or partnership collaboration planning to have. Obviously, complementarity. You also want to make sure that the team is able to work together, just because we've seen so many companies kind of crash because there was a problem of alignment of interest between the members of the founding team. Sometimes not the same common values or roadmap or vision for the projects. And for that, one of the things that you can also kind of look at is their past and try to see if there is any kind of common history of collaboration in the past that makes you think that they're going to be, avoiding any conflicts of interest in the future. Another element, and this is something that usually investors, our institutional investors that we work with, and I'll also share some more words about what we do at Allometrics. Something that really kind of try to assess is how the management team is actually secured, right? Because you probably know that one of the biggest assets when you look at a startup company is the management team. It has a strong impact on the growth of the company, and you just want to make sure that this company is not leaving tomorrow, right? So how they are secured. And finally, another good thing that we always like to evaluate is the business network of the management team, just because when you launch a new company, you kind of want to make sure that you can leverage any business network you may have to ensure a very rapid market entry, as it's always hard to get the first references, the first clients. So that was on the management team part. Moving to the project part, a lot of investors, especially in Silicon Valley area, they really focusing on the product, right? How the product is innovative, or how is it differentiating from existing solutions out there in the market. Within the company, as we work not only from investors, but also and mainly for corporate groups, innovation teams, they're sometimes looking to launch as POCs or strategic partnerships or co-development opportunities with startups. They really want to look at other things on top of the product, right? So they really want to assess here also the maturity of the project, so how mature the company is on the tech side, on the commercial side. What's the traction of the business nationally or internationally? how the business model is scalable, what's the brand awareness that the company has managed to create. So all the kind of things that we cover within this part, and they're key to consider. And finally, moving to the market part here, it's mainly very traditional elements that we evaluate. So obviously the product market fit, the market size, and the growth of the market, but obviously here the level of competition and the defensibility that the startup company has managed to raise within its own market. So this is actually what we do here. Allometrics kind of evaluate startups for, as I mentioned, corporate innovation teams, investment, M&A, accelerators, but also sometimes for procurement and risk, because here obviously there is a matter of whether partnering with that company or using it as a supplier and de-risking that upcoming collaboration. So just a matter, finishing on that, I think the ratings that we managed to build, I think it was one of the first strengths of that methodology. It's the fact that it's backed by a scientific methodology that is continuously backtested. Very quickly, what does backtested mean is the fact that we do follow the correlation between the ratings that we give to the startups and the effective growth of that company. So as soon as a company enters the rating process, 6 months, 12 months, or 24 months after the rating, we kind of keep KPI updates to kind of make sure that, you know, there is a strong correlation between our rating and the effective growth of that company. And here, as you can see on the screen, the results are pretty solid, because when you're looking at the top 20% companies that we rated as for now, actually 85% are experiencing high growth. On the contrary, if you're looking at the bottom 20% of those companies, only 30% are facing growth. So I think the really innovation team, especially as is our audience today, they use that for the decision-making process when it comes to assessing the reliability of that potential partner. But also, and it's something that we discovered over time was really important, is to help them in the communication process internally. So how to convince the top management, how to convince sometimes even the business unit or the procurement department to launch those collaborations, which is sometimes tricky, right? So so that was it for, I would say, the well-established way to evaluate a startup. Moving forward to how to make sure that this startup company is actually the good partner for you based on your own needs. You know, I just thought of a use case, always kind of straightforward. You know, generally, which is one of our clients here in Europe. You know, here, Daniel is not the contact name, but let's say it's our client. He's part of business unit VP products, and he's obviously here aware of the strong competition out there in the market in the insurance industry, and trying to set up, let's say, a long-term partnership with the tech, a long-term partnership with a startup on the tech side. So obviously our methodology and the criteria that I talked to you about right before are still out there. They do make sense, but not all of them. Let me just give you some examples. So as I mentioned here, Daniel is looking to set up a tech partnership, right? So there are some key metrics that always make sense, and we keep making sense here. So what's the level of innovation, for instance, of the product, right? As he's planning here, the idea behind that tech partnership is to differentiate from you know, existing competitors and new entrants. It's very important to kind of go and try to assess what's the level of innovation on the tech side of that potential partner, and what's the IP behind, and things like that. So that still makes sense. Another aspect is the technical maturity. Looking at the tech side and the ability to kind of scale that solution internally, especially as we're talking about, you know, a very big organization, there is a matter of scalability. And we see that some early stage company, they're still at a prototype or MVP stage. Would that one make sense here? Just because there is a matter of deploying that solution widely internally, and they won't be able to fit that constraint. You know, other criteria that obviously are important, but they're important for any kind of business unit if they're planning to set up a long-term partnership with a startup, is the ability of the team to actually run a company on the business side. I mean, that might seem very natural, but it's not always the case, because some founders, they are very strong tech profiles, sometimes coming out from with PhDs coming up from research work, and this is their first work experience. So there is a matter of kind of make sure that the management team is able to run a business on the long run, which is not always validated. And obviously here, the financial sustainability of the company, just because if you're looking to set up a partnership on the next 24 months, you just want to make sure that this company is going to be there after that moment of time and won't crash. However, very quickly on that, there are some criteria and metrics that won't make sense anymore, right? Because if you're looking to set up a tech partnership, then knowing about the team's commercial and marketing skills or business network, this is not something that really matters to you. It would be the case if you're looking to set up a business partnership, but it's not the case here. Same for the company's brand awareness. You're planning here to integrate a tech within your own solutions. So it's still Generali's brand that's important and not the startup's one. So you don't really want to focus on that. And, metrics like market size or team financial incentive, those are not things that you really want to dig into, as you're not planning to invest money in the company. You're planning right now to just set up that tech partnership. However, new criteria could be very important to you. In that case, we know that Daniel kind of experienced in the past a partnership with a non-French startup, and he's based in Paris. So he's right now looking to partner with startups or only in France. So geographic location, it's one of his criteria that is very specific to his own needs and his own experience. Same for the company's culture, risk culture, sorry. As we mentioned here, Generali seems to have a very risk-averse kind of corporate culture, and on that sense, going towards later stage companies really makes sense, because those are companies that do have a stronger track record and ability to kind of scale with other clients, and it's easier to go and navigate the corporate world and convince whether procurement, top management, or business units. Very quickly, who we are. So as Michael has presented earlier on, we are a rating agency for startups and innovative SMEs. We actually are present across 3 continents. So right now opening the US office. So we're across Europe, China, and the US. As for now, the opportunity to rate more than 3,000 companies across very different industries. So when we rate companies, we always meet up with the founding teams. So those are more than 3,000 founding teams that we meet up with across very different countries. And we work for more than 350 clients, and 30% of them are today institutional investors, and 70% are actually innovation teams, CVCs or M&A teams, accelerators, or business units. So that's pretty much us. If there is any question about the diligence process or us as a company, feel free to ask those at the end of the webinar. Thank you. I pass it to Jim.
Thank you so much, Maria. And Jim, the floor is yours.
And hey, Jim, maybe before you get started, we should also queue people up that they can start getting their questions ready, whether it's something we'll talked about or something that you're about to talk about or something Maria covered. So we will try to get to as many of those as we can.
Yeah, I'm going to be as brief as possible because I really want to hear the questions. So the one thing when we started our prep conversation is the order we go in can be any. It's a chicken and egg continuum. And Michael mentioned that he's got a haystack to find the needle in. I actually wrote a TED book called A Haystack Full of Needles. And the thesis of that book was about refining the pattern recognition you need to make better decisions. And from a partnership perspective, it's really the objectives and the key results you're seeking. One way of visualizing it, we don't have a slide on this, but many of you are probably familiar with what a business model canvas looks like. And what's the goal of the partnership? Are you trying to add a customer segment? Are you seeking a new channel? Are you trying to lower costs? Are you looking for key resources or a new way to expand, get, keep, and grow your customers? And part of the idea of having a Google search engine in front of you is you got to know what you're looking for. And if you think about the basics, Michael mentioned a technology readiness level, a TRL. We've actually done some work in something we call the investment readiness level. Is this company far enough along on my needs to understand whether or not they're worthy of an investment? And it's important not to confuse a partnership with a commercial agreement. If they're a vendor or a supplier or you to them, that doesn't necessarily be something of partnership material. Partners provide value to and from each other. And so what's important is you kind of want to lay out in a spectrum the assumptions you're bringing in, because Maria talked about you have to fit with the need. What is that need? And at its core element level, pattern recognition is about three things. It's about collecting the dots that are out there, creating some new dots to fill in the blanks, and then ultimately connecting those dots. And what Glidr has done, if we move on to the next slide, I don't know that I have control of the screen, but I think you might, Scott or Michael, is if you can be very thoughtful of outlining the assumptions that you want to bring into a proof of concept or a pilot. The word we use is running experiments. And don't run the easy experiments, run the riskiest experiments. Challenge the assumption that if this somehow isn't working, if it's not delivering, then it's not going to be worthy of the resources it takes to really cultivate a real corporate partnership. And that's hard, because a lot of things that people want to do beyond the normal, to be disruptive, require some bold risks and bold experiments. So whatever's in the marketplace, you'll know, you'll get the research, you'll work with those companies, but getting in front of customers, prospects, current and future customers to test the hypothesis and the assumptions are where better decisions get made. So if we go to the next slide, the idea of the experiments you run are as simple as talking to 17 hospital administrators and understanding if this new technology is something they would use, could use, want. And the key when you're running these experiments is to get a high fidelity signal. If possible, get permission to record the conversation. A lot of times what you think you're hearing in retrospect might be something quite different as you gather more evidence and more information. And if you think about within the companies, all the experiments that you've run and all of the evidence you've gathered over years, it tends to be lost. And so we have this belief that, no whiteboard should be erased, no Post-it note thrown away, because if you can share these insights and failures and successes across teams, across divisions, and across time, you'll be better at assessing what those needs are. So in fact, the dots you create in the current experiments are intellectual exhaust for future opportunities. And we didn't do that opportunity a few years ago because oil was $80 a barrel, and we forgot about it. Well, oil's not $80 a barrel anymore. Let's take a look at that. Bandwidth has gotten cheaper. The changes in technology, the changes in regulation, the changes in competition are all excuses to reevaluate yesterday's failure, which might become tomorrow's success. So if we go to the last slide, the key is to be highly quantitative about what you're looking for. And as you gather the evidence, that becomes a repository for collaboration and insight and understanding and ultimately conclusions. So the OKRs, the objectives and key results, need to be understood and agreed to before you begin these pilots. Otherwise, they run for 3 months or 6 months or 9 months with an uncertain outcome. And the key for a lot of very successful partnerships that ultimately became acquisitions have to do with creating great value for both companies. Facebook bought Instagram because they bought a younger customer segment. And if you kind of deconstruct what's the reason behind these acquisitions, these partnerships, these investments, you ultimately can put it in one of a half a dozen buckets. And it's really helpful before you go to the database of SwitchPitch is to understand what resources or activities you're looking for, what value proposition you don't have or you want to amplify. And the more precise you are crafting those queries and searches, the better results you're going to get from a SwitchPitch, the better the diligence you'll be able to do, and ultimately the better data you'll be able to cultivate and create for yourselves. So simple, high level, last slide, we're done, is thinking about the investment readiness level, how to get the potential startup partnership to fit your need, and doing it in a holistic, data-centric way to inform the decision makers what they do and don't want to invest in. And I'd much rather hear the questions than hear me speak.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Jim. And let us open it up to Scott's questions and then others' questions if people have them.
Yeah, I was going to say I'd love to hear what questions our participants have. I love the concept, Jim, that you were talking about, which is kind of, there aren't shelved projects or, dumpstered projects, but they're just projects that maybe not right to pursue right now, that you kind of want to keep those learnings and keep that data around because there might be a moment in the future when you come back to things.
I guess in one way, Scott, it's very much like when Salesforce.com was created. In the days before Salesforce, the salesperson had the Rolodex, and they took their contacts with them. And the idea of continuity of sales is the same idea of continuity of innovation and continuity of experiments. So in fact, these are valuable assets for the company if they treat them as a data acquisition mode to begin with. Because in hindsight, the people leave, the files are lost, and you can't recreate them.
Right. No, it's a great point. I guess I wonder, if, first of all, I'd love to ask two participants if they have any examples or experiences that they want to share. That's okay too. We don't just want to take questions. But like role models for startup engagement, I'm curious what any of you would say in terms of examples of someone who's doing some aspect of scouting or piloting or partnering well right now. And I guess one that I would toss out because we just talked to them recently is, Intel Capital is one of the older corporate venture capital groups. They said something really interesting about startups that they invest in. Almost all of them need help with sales, and just getting more customers into the funnel. And so that can be an easy initial way to work with people in Intel's sales force is to say, hey, we have this product which may be of interest to some of your customers. Do you want to try bringing this company along or talking about what they do to your customers? And so you're helping a startup that Intel has invested in, and you're not trying to make a super complicated case to a business unit about how to integrate these two things. It's just, could the sales force sell this as an add-on, bolt-on, which I thought was, an interesting win-win, easy way to benefit, Intel's customers and the startups that they invest in. But other examples of kind of role models?
Yeah, so Scott, reframing that in the same words of a business model canvas, you're talking about a channel partnership where there's an additional value proposition brought to current customers, which for Intel's reason is to keep and grow those customers. And so, I think that there is a common language to identify those prospects and those experiments you can run. I'm involved in a virtual reality company now that's doing a lot of military work for the Air Force. And getting into military contractors is a real different business. And finding partners that have expertise and knowledge of those sales cycles and those contacts is done through a strategic partnership, and it makes all the sense in the world. The farther afield each party is from needing value, the more intriguing and the riskier and the more expensive those partnerships can be.
The one that comes to mind for me, Scott, is Johnson & Johnson. I think that you guys have worked with them. They have the Innovation Center in Boston. And the reason I think that I admire their program, and we have no business relationship with them, I'm just impressed with their program. They break it into an innovation center, actually global innovation centers that interface with startups, but then each business unit has their own innovation person who will evaluate very scientific or specific things and then feed it up to the innovation center to run through the process. And it's very structured, it's very documented, and the thing I like about it the most is everybody internally knows it. And I think what we hear a lot of enterprises struggle with is, how do we change the culture? How do we get people to pay attention to startups? And I really feel like I don't know how they've done it, but they've really done a good job changing that culture.
Yeah, and I guess just to add on a level to that, Michael, that was something that was under the purview of their chief scientific officer, Paul Stoffels. And so it wasn't like some side project that didn't report to someone senior enough. It was like, hey, the guy who oversees R&D is overseeing this. And so, it's clear that this is, something that we're committed to, and we're going to, they've now done it probably for 6-7 years, that strategy. So I think that's a great example. Sorry, Marie, you were going to jump in.
Yeah, so, talking more about where we saw also in Europe here. So I don't know if you guys looked at, the recent awards being given to, some big corporates here in Europe when it comes to, open innovation programs and startup engagement. Samsung Electronics comes to mind, just because they do have a broad and deep engagement with a variety of startups, startup communities, particularly those active in hardware and software, but also services like mobile communications, consumer electronics, automotive industries. And I recall that, last year they kind of brought in, a strong support to startups, kind of invested more than, $200 million in about 75 startups worldwide. And they kind of expect to keep those investments to grow in the future. So, we've been talking about the challenges earlier on when it comes to corporate startup engagement, and resources is one of them. So, having that kind of corporates kind of bringing the right resources to the community of startups worldwide across different topics, that's, something that I wanted to share here.
Cool. There's a comment from one of our participants that says, big corporations working with startups can be seen as a PR exercise and not just for innovations. I definitely agree there that a lot of times, startup engagement, there's a lot of, it's just sort of like we want the pixie dust of startups and innovation to be sprinkled on our company. And we're not really clear that we're going to be, as you said, Maria, we're going to be making investments in companies, or we're going to be pilot testing or helping them sell. So it can be a PR exercise. And I would even go so far to say some companies spend a lot of money to start an accelerator program, and they'll have 12 startups come to their office space that they provide for 3 months. And even that level of investment may still just be a PR exercise and nothing substantive.
Yeah, Scott, so it was over 20 years ago, so you have to kind of carbon date the experience. But, America Online was beginning to innovate with their platform, and they formed some of the more successful partnerships because they needed content, they needed commerce, they needed community. And so they formed the Greenhouse. The first investment they made was actually before the Greenhouse, which was with my company, Preview Travel, to take their customer base and provide them with travel services. They invested in iVillage to create content for women, and Net Noir for the African-American community, because they had their own product roadmap and they knew the holes they needed to fill. So they put not only the capital, but the internal human resources behind the success that they needed to see so that their customers got a real benefit. And that was all about building product market fit, understanding the value propositions in their customer segments well enough, and then surgically hunting for the things in the marketplace that could benefit from access to their customers, and their customers could benefit from access to their technologies or their services or their content. And so that is a perfect example of companies knowing what they're good at and what they're not good at, and then trying to find the best complement to their internal resources and strengths by forming strategic partnerships with outside companies.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I hate to admit that I'm old enough that I remember that Greenhouse project at America Online, but I didn't know that you
I've got AOL CDs that I use for coffee coasters. It's an ancient technology.
I know we're running short on time, so I'd love it if there are other comments, questions. The one thing that I was going to toss out there is we've done a little bit of writing about what are the things entrepreneurs complain about. If you get a group of entrepreneurs in a room and you ask them what are the biggest pains in the butt when it comes to working with big companies, we've put together some of those lists. I think it's pretty easy to do if your company is in, or if you're involved in being an interface between big companies and startups. If you get 6 or 8 venture-backed entrepreneurs, or seed-funded entrepreneurs in a room, you could create a pretty quickly a list of these are 8 or 10 things you need to solve if you really want to be seen as a partner of choice for startups. And as I said, we've done some of that, but it's pretty easy to do for yourself. Maybe you're focused on a specific industry vertical, and you think you'll get different results. Another comment from a participant: agility of big companies must be #1 issue. Yeah, I agree that you can't follow your standard operating procedures and have an effective startup engagement startup ecosystem, startup investing strategy. Michael, as you know, funding deals move really quick, and you can't be debating for 3 months, are we going to invest in this company that may be the next Uber and is probably closing their round, if not tomorrow, then 2 days from now.
Right. My one point on the pain point of entrepreneurs, and it's really the reason I started SwitchPitch, is because I've had other startups that were very hard to form partnerships with big companies. And so I decided to do something about it by creating more transparency. And so the pain point that, I think that startups have is that the deals get dragged on to death. Now, this is going back before I started SwitchPitch, 7, 8 years ago. But historically, there was no transparency, and startups would run out of cash because they'd start to tell their investors, hey, we're talking to this company or that company, because they seem really promising because the big companies wanted to be encouraging. I think now corporates have a little bit more idea of what they're looking for. And so to define the needle is a lot clearer, and they don't waste their time talking to startups that they're not at least somewhat interested in actually forming a real partnership, and they have budget behind it. I think that was one of the things that has been missing in the past.
So I would chime in and say it's a series of very quick, meaningful experiments, because how do you know which company, and there's diligence you want to do on the company and their founders and the capital base and all that stuff. But all that's irrelevant if there's not an experiment that's validated, that gives you the encouragement to go forward. I think a lot of companies view this too holistically, too long-term. I encourage every startup I work with or invest in to forget about getting money from corporates. That's the least valuable thing they give you. The most valuable thing is either their technology, their customers, their knowledge, their insight. And those don't take years to develop. You could put together, if you find the right partner, in a matter of weeks, you can structure the experiment, and in a matter of a small number of months, get evidence and data to prove whether it's worth doing. So the ethos of the lean startup informs product management. We don't know for sure. Let's try this and see if it works. Let's not overinvest in it and find out it's wrong. So a series of small failures leading to a big success is indicative of how this world works well. The unicorns, I think Y Combinator might have had like 8 or 10, maybe a dozen unicorns, but 6,000 or 7,000 companies have gone through Y Combinator. So it doesn't mean that the next one is great or bad. It's just a process where 85% failure rate is the norm for venture capital. And so what you don't want to do is overinvest in too many or too few things, rather, but run a portfolio of experiments to find out which are the best ones for you.
I agree totally, Jim. If we were to do kind of a quick lightning round of if people want to find out more about each organization, Michael, do you want to start, and then Maria, and then Jim, and we'll conclude?
Yeah, absolutely. So to reach out to me directly, it's mag@switchpitch.com, mag@switchpitch.com, or just go to switchpitch.com, and there's different submission forms there. And even if you just want to talk shop, I love to talk about this stuff. Oh, the one other thing, sorry, that I wanted to just say is on what can a corporate do specifically to encourage startup partnerships is change your legal agreements and procurement. That's I think the number one killer. It takes so long to get, and if you have to have a lawyer as a startup review an agreement, and you have to have crazy stuff on the tech side, it just to do a pilot, it doesn't work. Chick-fil-A is a client, and they do a really, really good job at that.
Maria?
Yeah, on my site, so it's maria@earlymetrics.com. So again, here, if you have any kind of work ongoing with a potential partner, if you face difficulties convincing top management, business units, procurement to work with a startup you already identified, feel free to reach out to us. We'll help you in that sense. Thank you.
Sure, Glidr.io, glidr.io. Free trial. See if what we have helps you plan and run your experiments, and if it does, there are enterprise licenses that can give you a holistic approach to the chaos and confusion that you poor people have to deal with every day, and for which we apologize. It's a mess. We're trying to make it a little bit easier.
Cool. And as I mentioned, Scott@innovationleader.com. Got a couple of requests already for the startup engagement report, and we'll send those out ASAP. But thanks everybody for tuning in, and thanks Maria, Jim. Thanks